Right, good to have you on the show to talk about various things around marketing, brands, challenger brands, beautiful constraints. How is it shaping up in Asia and from your perspective around in the world?
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm up for absolutely anything. You can ask me any question you like, and I'll give you a reply.
Amazing. That's
Anything.
awesome. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Excellent. So, Adam, I just want to start. I mean, with the current context of how's the pandemic been and how's work been around with you. I know we had this chat where you said that your culture has been a very family-like culture and staying apart. And I know the world is right now fractured down the whole line of people are saying who needs meetings, right? Who needs offices, right? Everything is going to move to Zoom and so on and so forth. And coming from a advertising agency environment where the energy on the floor was always a benchmark of how we are doing culturally, right? And I remember at times when I saw the energy kind of flagging down, we would put some high pitched music and make sure that the energy kind of come back.
We suddenly literally hit a moment in March last year where people weren't meeting up, let alone getting on. The clients have one, they are quite prepared to forgive temporary glitches. They're quite prepared to accept little moments of humanity that otherwise would be absurd
Yeah.
in a meeting. So one of my first workshops, we were doing a local workshop in the UK, and the head client, new marketing director, her child came in an hour into the workshop and their pet hamster had died, and she
Oh
needed
my
to
God.
go outside with the kid and help bury the hamster for 90 minutes in the middle of this workshop because it was the child's first encounter with kind
Yeah.
of pet catastrophe, and that was kind of okay with everybody. So
Yeah.
much to our surprise, actually, the business has just evolved. I mean, clearly, I think it's better in some ways, it's compromised in others, but we're very busy, and I'm delighted about that. But your point about culture is right on the nose. I, like you, kind of born and raised and love the cross-fertilization of advertising. I like working with
Yeah.
other people. I like being across the
Yeah.
table with other people. I like big pads and
Yeah.
drawing stuff, exchanging ideas and casual conversations while you're making coffee. And we don't do any of that. We can't do any of that. You can sort of
Yeah.
try and force it, but it's a
Yeah.
real comes at a real cost to our peripheral vision and our peripheral. That's at the root of
Yeah.
so much creativity, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, while you mentioned that you miss
Yeah.
and doing the economy flights, I do miss being with people and that exchange. And you can have cross conversations. You can do so much more. So I'm not completely convinced that this is more efficient way
Yeah.
of doing
Yeah. I
business.
think you can, what I've found is you can run faster in a straight line working from home.
Yeah.
But your ability to do the really interesting stuff and take those little detours that lead to the more
Yeah.
interesting ways of seeing
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
are compromised by it.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it. Amazing. So, Adam, switching gears and getting to the meat of the conversation that I want to have with you. And obviously, if I'm talking to you, I want to speak about challenger brands, and I want to throw a few contexts of my own on the challenger brands. In fact, some of the theory that I've been struggling with or debating in my own mind, based on a lot of work we've been doing in Asia and India, particularly in last decade or so. So how do we look at an idea of challenger brands or what do we challenge, especially in the context like Asia or India, where bulk of the work we're doing is building categories, right? So I'm not challenging a competition. I'm not challenging yet another brand who's got a dominant market share and
Mm,
challenging them. I'm in most cases, if say I'm building a category of streaming videos in India, or building a
mhm,
category of streaming music or e-commerce or breakfast cereals, if you like, or say sanitary napkin in rural India. In
mhm,
most of these cases, whether these are technology platforms or even some of the newer categories for which the consumption doesn't go down as deep with 600 million consumers, I'm largely on a daily basis faced with the task of building a category. And what I am we are kind of batting against or batting with are current behaviors of people. Our enemies are more either current behaviors or some notions or some behavior change we want to make happen, rather than yet another brand. uh,
mhm.
right. So in a context like Asia, India, in economies which are still developing, where categories are under penetrated. How do we see the idea of challenger brands, and what do we really challenge? Is that the redefinition that we look at? So your thoughts on that is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, listen. I think you've just put your finger on a really important point, which is there is still sometimes a tendency to think of challengers as smaller player challenging bigger player. So in other words,
Yeah,
challengers challenge someone, and of course you have to challenge the next nature of being a challenger. But I think increasingly, if you look at the challengers that have really kind of defined the modern marketing world, they're not challenging someone, they're challenging something. They're challenging something about the category. They're challenging something about the behavior of the customer. They're challenging something
yeah,
about the kind of complacent ways of doing things. And so the most recent work that I've kind of been doing over the last couple of years is a book called Overthrow, written with a media company PhD, and looking at 10 different kinds something. So for instance, next generation challengers say, look, there was a whole way of thinking and behaving at one point that was right for that time. It's a new time, it's a new world. That was then, this is now. It's time for a new way of thinking and behaving around this. Enlightened zaggers say, well, look, I know that the trend is to think of the world like this, and this is the important thing in the world, but actually, really, if you stop and think about it, this is the most important thing, and therefore this is the way to use
yeah.
and engage with, TV or entertainment, that kind of stuff.
Mm.
So I think what you've put your finger on is absolutely at the heart of how challenger thinking is evolving very dynamically, with a new generation of challengers coming through. But at the same time, I think there's an interesting tension in there, isn't there? Because when we've talked about this in the past, you and me, one of the kind of interesting conversations we had is, so is it just a land grab, right? Do you not need to
Yeah,
challenge anything really, or do you
yeah,
you're just putting your product out there and making people aware of it? And I guess what I would say to that is, even there, if you don't know what you're challenging, you don't really have a growth strategy, because part of the job that one's doing in that situation, and you as an agency are doing that situation as strategic thinkers, is how do I accelerate this as fast as possible?
yeah,
That acceleration, that notion of acceleration in that land grab, has at its heart the notion of challenge, right? I have to
yeah,
challenge as quickly and as efficiently as possible what's the
yeah,
status quo. It's just a
yeah.
different version of being a challenge.
How are you going to build the categories? How are you going to accelerate the momentum in a certain category?
I
Yeah,
completely agree. I completely agree. There's a lovely quote. So one of my favorite Indian challengers and
yeah,
done this very
yes,
disruptive stuff.
yeah,
And I was reading an interview with their kind of country head, who's talking about one of the things they're trying to do is create a culture of inquiry,
yes,
with the consumer. I thought that was really
yeah,
interesting, because it is that unanswered questions can be less dangerous than unquestioned answers. And
yeah,
what you're trying to do in building categories is challenge unquestioned answers. You're trying to say,
yeah,
actually, the answer you've been using for the last 5 years, that is not actually the answer you need most. You
yeah,
needed a different answer. And
yeah,
I think that's right at the heart of everything you're
yeah,
talking about in
yeah.
challenges in India.
Yeah, yeah, and from that perspective, then suddenly the whole landscape becomes pretty open and wide, right? I mean, I now reflect some of the work we did on Amazon as a brand when we launched it in India, and for the first year or so, we had this whole platform of what in Hindi says "or dikhao" in English means "show me more."
Right.
Right, and we just own the so Indian cultural idea that when an Indian goes out and buys something, they'll look at some 20 pieces of cloth and then come back and buy the first one. It's a very classical classical Indian behavior.
Yeah.
You want to map the whole market before you choose, right? And chances are you come back to the original place, right? And we use that insight, and we wanted to use and own the idea of selection
Mm-hmm.
for Amazon, because we are shifting an offline behavior of going to the neighborhood store to an online behavior, and we said the biggest code of the category is selection, and let's begin to own that. And that was the first thing. were challenging, that you may not get everything in your neighborhood store, you'll get it here, right? So that was
Yeah.
the notion. And then we moved on to challenging other things. Then we moved on to the second piece we did was, we said apni dukan, which says your own neighborhood store, because we said that Amazon gives you the same personalization that your neighborhood guy does. In fact, it doesn't, but we kind of made believe that, because
Mm,
it calls you by your name, it says you bought this last time, here's something else you can buy, and so on and so forth. And in India, we had cash on delivery, so you could pay once you receive the product. So
right.
we put all of that together, and this is as good as your neighborhood store, as your own shop, your own neighborhood store, apni dukan. So we kept moving
Mm,
from
mm,
challenging one notion to the other, and that's how we kind of opened the category for them.
that's
So
really interesting.
yeah, so you're saying that, yeah, it is about challenging. What are you challenging as a notion of, or the idea of, rather than who you are challenging, and that's very, very interesting.
Yes, completely agree. And I think, and as I say, holding as part of that, that challenger is not just about little player versus big player. It's actually about a mindset primarily, rather than a state of market.
Yeah,
And how one continues and maintains that is really important. I was reading before Christmas, so Netflix um, interview with the founder, Reed Hastings, saying Netflix is still in challenger mode. Now
yeah,
Netflix is was it $25 billion company now? So it's two-thirds the size of the Coca-Cola company. And I remember reading that and being quite struck by that. Okay, so this is
yeah,
great. They still see themselves as a challenger. Actually, of course, he was very prescient, because 3 months in, we then see the data in about Disney Plus. Disney Plus has put on um, the same amount of subscribers in a year that Netflix took a decade to put on, and is projected to overtake it globally in 18 months. So however fast you're building your category,
yeah,
there's always a chance that somebody's coming up hard on your
yeah,
shoulder and building it even faster behind you, right? So that
yeah.
challenger mindset, absolutely critical, as you say.
Yeah, yeah, and continuous sense of change as well, right? Moving from one thing to the other. I mean, it's not that you've challenged something once and you're now sitting pretty and saying,
Mm.
"Wow, I'm there as well." But a continuous sense of challenge is what I'm reading from you as well.
I think
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, I think because
yeah,
one of the really interesting things, I think, is the way that the consumer's expectations have completely changed from the way that, when I started out. So when I started out in advertising, which was a really long time ago, what we were taught was it's all about trade-offs, right? You can't be the fastest car and the most fuel efficient car. You can't be, safe and sexy. You can't be high quality and free. You have to make
yeah,
that. The whole point about strategy is making these choices. And a whole generation of brands have come along which have torn up all those trade-offs and educated
yeah.
the consumer to think we don't need to have those trade-offs anymore. So I'm
Yes,
calling this new generation of consumers Uber's children, right? Because they've been taught that they can have it all, probably free, or certainly at an incredibly cheap price,
yeah,
because somebody else is going to pick up most of the tab for that. And so their expectations, I mean, they're really demanding bunch, as you know, and
yeah,
that's quite, bracing, but also
yeah,
very exciting. And unless you keep
yeah,
up with that constantly changing
yeah,
expectation, and of course Jeff Bezos is very good about this, right? He talks about the fact that you can never actually catch up with that
yeah,
level of expectation.
yeah,
As soon as you
yeah,
think you've got to it, it will have raised again.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you're right,
yeah,
you've got to
yeah,
keep challenging those
yeah.
assumptions.
Yeah, I'll come back and pick up this whole conversation speed a little bit more in detail, Adam. But before that, I have another kind of context to throw on the challenger brand theory. And see, one of the things, at least I realize for India and Asia as well, is that it's a very high power distance culture, right? So hierarchy is embedded, and in fact, strangely, in the Indian environment, a lot of youth, for example, seek mentors, and they like the organization almost to be like parents, right? So
Really, right? Yeah.
there's a continuous search for a sense of hierarchy. There's a continuous search for a sense of who's the leader. I mean, the culture is so obsessed with building heroes, for example, and gods and so on and so forth, right? So
Mm,
there's a kind of a obsession with hierarchy and power distance, right, across Asia. I have this, and in some ways, there's a need to say, okay, who's the leader, right? Who's the leader of the pack, whether in life, in culture, or in the category, right?
yeah.
And I have this story that I tell, that I mean, in India, the airports have been kind of modernized in last decade or so. So about a decade earlier, you went to the Delhi airport, right? There was one door, there was one gate to enter the airport, and the queue went all the way back, almost till the main road, right? And everybody's standing. There was a sense of assurance, perhaps, in that everything's fine. And suddenly you had these new swanky international style airports and 24 gates, and all of those gates are fine. And you went back to this airport, right? And you saw that there's still one long queue on gate number one, which goes all the way back up, and all the other 23 gates are empty, because somewhere in their mind, people are thinking that if there are so many people standing in this line, there must be
Mm-hmm.
something right about it. Why
Mm-hmm.
make a mistake by going anywhere else, right? So there's a certain comfort in numbers over there. And I looked
Yeah.
at that, and I carried a study where I went back and looked at across categories, and I realized that almost all the categories, depending on how fragmented you were, top 70 to 80% of market share was being explained by top two or three players at best, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's a car brand in India which is Maruti Suzuki, which is Suzuki in partnership with the Indian players, and they just keep growing bigger and bigger, right? It's not that they
Mm-hmm.
have the best cars. I mean, there are other German players with sturdier and more effective motoring technology, but Suzuki wins because people realize you can't go wrong buying a Maruti.
So I hear
Right.
that. I absolutely hear that. And I understand that's culturally true. And yet I am fascinated by what is happening
Yeah,
to Hindustan Unilever at the moment. So
yeah,
you've got local brands taking on
yeah,
acts with very famous kind of advertising, essentially
yes,
saying that when you spray yourself with Axe, most of what you're buying is gas, really. You're not getting the good
yes,
stuff. We have more
yes,
perfume in. And they've
yes,
completely changed the landscape to the deo
yeah,
fragrance
yeah,
in a really short amount of time. Again, I love that Sebamed stuff. So what it demonstrates to me, I think, is yes, I accept that that is a kind of a cultural challenge for any challenger, and yet there are people who are doing it, but they're being quite
yeah,
dramatic in
yeah,
terms of forcing reappraisal. So you
yeah,
can't be too nuanced and subtle, I think, is my
yeah,
feeling about this. You've got to say, actually, you know what, you are being shortchanged with your current choices. There's a
yeah,
much better way of doing it, and it's
yeah,
still possible, therefore, to be a successful
yeah,
challenger.
yeah.
Is that
Or
fair?
or would you, sure, or would you also say, just to debate this a bit more, would you say that it's leader's job as well to challenge, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and show the new way, uh,
I think that's absolutely right. Because
right? And
and this comes back to being a challenger, being a
yeah,
mindset, right? I mean,
yeah,
I think
yeah,
you could argue that one of the big changes over the last 20 years is it's not that challenger mindset is only relevant for small brands. You could argue
yeah,
that the only way to maintain market leadership these days is to
yeah,
retain that challenger mindset that got you there. Because if you
yeah,
don't, someone is coming up hard on your shoulder
yeah,
and they will eat
yeah.
you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's an interesting one, right? And that again brings me to this whole construct on speed that I wanted to have a chat with you about, right? I mean, again, none of the marketing theory and none of the business theory ever speaks about speed. In fact, the more you read about all the theory, it's about long term, right? The brand
Mm-hmm.
is in the long term and it takes time, and everything which is about the short term is left to say tactics, and that's not strategic at all. And you look at that, and then suddenly we see, for example, a lot of brands we built in India. They've been built in last 5 years. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
phenomena that you see that have come up in India have come up in last 5 to 6 years, right? And I mean, so whether it's Amazon, Spotify, uh, Phone Pay, all of these brands have come up and become really, really huge, like 400 million consumers. I mean, Geo, for example, 600 million internet users in 4 years, 5 years time band, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so, so the more we think about it, speed seems to become so critical. So one is obviously the whole theory that you can only build a brand in long term is getting challenged. So you can perhaps build and use brand as a lever and a leverage for short term growth. That's one. Second is what we are learning also is that if you wait far too long for success, right? There is, as I was talking to you, there doesn't seem to be a gradual kind of a bell curve of adoption and so on and so forth. Most phenomena which become successful, or most brands which are getting success, have a hockey stick shape. So
Mm-hmm.
so you boom to adoption, and suddenly you become a phenomena, and it's also in some sense that if everybody's using it, you must be good, and it kind of catches on very, very
Mm-hmm.
quickly,
Mm-hmm.
or you're gone, right? I mean, you get rejected and you're out. So speed is important there as well. So if you're waiting far too long to get adopted, and if you're not turbocharging your efforts right upfront and not being
Hmm.
able to make that escape velocity, chances are you're going to fall off. And the third point is what you make is that if you're not fast enough, there's somebody coming behind you to eat you off. So I want to discuss this whole idea of speed in marketing and branding, and how do you see that as a almost a critical element now of frameworks, because it is not of any model or framework as yet.
I completely agree, and I think we're going to talk later on about beautiful constraints, but I think speed is a beautiful constraint for any marketer today.
Yeah.
And we live in this interesting tension, don't we, between two deltas. One delta is, let's learn from Facebook, move fast and break things. Speed is beautiful, speed is better. And the other is, we've all seen worlds where actually speed equals worse and speed equals compromised. You look at what happened a few years ago to Samsung when they rushed out their gallery note and the battery started exploding and the debacle attached to that. So it's not that speed is universally good, right? Speed does come with kind of caveats. And even Facebook has changed its quote from move fast and break things to move fast with a stable infrastructure. So even they have acknowledged that you've got to have some. So the question, I think, is, so what is the stable infrastructure for speed, right? That's a really interesting question for us as marketers. And I've done quite a lot of work on this, actually. And just to kind of cut a long story short, I think there are some very simple things you can learn about how to do speed well. So first of all, you have to have a governing ambition that doesn't allow slow, that doesn't allow tweaking. It's much easier if you have single metrics rather than complicated metrics. Everyone has a simple metric that's going on. I learned a lot. One of the techniques I'm using with clients a lot, which is a very simple technique, and you're going to laugh at its sheer naivety, but actually it's surprisingly powerful, is I developed a back issue a few years ago and had to go and learn to swim again. I learned as a kid, and I could swim okay, but I wanted to swim better. And they teach you there are two ways to swim faster. Do you know what the two ways to swim faster are?
No, I'm curious.
All right. So one is the obvious one, which is increased propulsion, right? So basically, go to the gym, kick harder, kick faster, get bigger shoulders. The second one I think is interesting. The second one is decreased drag.
Wow.
You can increase propulsion or decrease drag.
Or decrease drag,
Yeah, and actually decreased drag is the easiest and quickest way to go faster. And so I spend a lot of time with clients saying, let's look at those two things. Which is the easiest one to do? What do you want to? And they always go, ooh, let's talk about decreasing drag. Really easy. What are the things we can take out of the way we do things at the moment that immediately allow us to go faster? So I think that's a really interesting question for us as marketers, which is, where is the drag in the marketing process at the moment? How can we decrease it? And that might be about team size. It might be about, keeping it really small and tight, focusing on one ambition, one metric. There's lots we can learn from people who've been this way before, but I do think you need a stable infrastructure to make it work.
Yeah. That's fantastic, because you were saying the speed is not just about the brand; it's pretty much the culture of the organization. It's it's much more deeper than just your marketing calendar, if you like.
Agreed, and I think it's also about the way that you frame the questions. So there's a really, because clearly even big companies are having to go much faster, even old legacy companies are going much faster. So there's a very interesting example of this with Barclays, the UK-based bank, where they were just aware that their whole social media and kind of digital media response was much too slow. It was taking them 3 or 4 months to formulate something. And so their head of digital said, let's stop thinking of this as a digital media department. Let's think of ourselves as a newsroom. Amazing. What happens in a newsroom, right? You can't wait 3 months to respond to a news item. Okay, you've got 24 hours at most. So how would a newsroom behave? So that frame by that leader completely changed the whole approach to speed in a much beneficial, and they learned from different categories. So I think it's as much about helping leaders reframing how we need to think about this as simply saying, let's go faster.
Yeah, well, interesting. I mean, we did something, in fact, at the onset of the pandemic in 2020, the last year, we launched a framework that we called 036, right? So we said, what's your strategy in 0, which is now? What's your strategy in 3, which is 3 months from now? And what's your strategy in 6, right? Because we realized that everything was so focused on long-term strategy. And suddenly, when everything changed, there was no framework to do strategy for the short term, because short term was always left to tactics. And that reframing helped a lot, because we were running workshops, asking clients questions. How could we change the business process at this point in time?
Right.
right? And in fact, we did one of the pieces of work for one of our clients called shadi.com, which is a matrimonial platform. So they get arranged marriages done through digital platform. But that's an
Hmm.
interesting proposition by itself. But we shifted marriages online, and with the with the works, right? The whole the great Indian big fat wedding, right? With music and Bollywood and Hina and everything online, and we built a platform for that as a result of
Amazing.
one of these workshops. So you're right. I mean, just reframing the question and reframing what you're looking at is a very interesting lever for speed.
Yeah, I think that I love your example there. The other thing I'm really intrigued by with speed is the relationship between speed and trust. So you know that
Mm.
very famous kind of study where Google looked at the small teams within Google and where they'd had the biggest impact, and what were the 3 or 4 success factors. And the most important success factor for small teams having a big impact in Google was psychological safety, the feeling that I could kind of say anything. And it
Yeah.
reminded me when I was doing interviews a few years ago for A Beautiful Constraint, I interviewed a couple of Navy SEALs. So these are kind of special forces in America, and they talked about their training because clearly they are going in these are small groups doing things really quickly and getting out again. I wanted to know what business could learn, if anything, from
Yeah.
those. And they talked a lot about, the training is really grueling. You have to stand in freezing water for 12 hours. You go to the desert for 5 days without sleep, all this kind of stuff. But the point they made was the purpose of all that training is not really about mental resilience or fitness, important those things are. What it's about is trust in the people around you. SEALs operate in groups of 4 or 8, and it's absolutely essential if you're going to do something with a small group really quickly. You absolutely trust each other's judgment. And I wonder whether we are spending enough time thinking about how we create that much more intense and close trust within a group and indeed with clients to
Yeah.
allow us to move at the speed we need to, that slows down, speeds up that decision-making process and
Yeah.
allows everybody to trust, just get on and do it, Adam, because
Yeah.
I know you that well. That's an interesting question
Yeah.
for us, I think,
Yeah. That's very
particularly in this more
interesting.
virtual environment. How
Yeah.
do you rapidly accelerate trust in a Zoom relationship?
Yeah.
That's one
Yeah.
of the key
Yeah.
tensions, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, and yeah, I mean, while this is much more deep, I think at a certain level, it also works for how brands can build trust with people, right? And my often thing is that imagine if you, I mean, for brands which do one television commercial once in a year, my
Mm-hmm.
question is that how would your wife or girlfriend feel if you had to speak to them only once in a year?
Yes.
Right. And therefore the therefore the case of having conversations far more frequently and having far more interesting pivots to the definition of your brand, so that you can talk to people far more often, and the more familiar you get, the more you talk to them, the more often you talk to them, chances are you can build trust with speed even in that context.
That's fascinating. So, do you think then that one of the primary roles of something like digital is that kind of continual conversational relationship that builds trust?
Yeah, because I mean, the fact that I'm there and I'm familiar, right? I mean, it's like, I mean, you meet somebody 3 times in a week for a year very, very quickly, and you feel that this friendship is so deep,
Mm, mm,
right? And I would say that would apply the same for the brand. So if I'm seeing this brand across my channels having interesting conversations with me, not just one conversation, and I find them familiar and I'm hanging around them, right? You begin to build a sense of trust, and therefore I'm challenging the notion that you can only build trust for brands in the long term. You can speed this up with greater familiarity at greater frequency, and digital allows you to do that. It's been a great conversation talking to you about speed and challenger brands, and how also the idea that how do we continuously, I mean, the whole idea of the fact that it's not one time strategy, right? You have to continuously keep at it, whether you're
yeah,
building trust,
yeah.
whether you're building a position, and so on and so forth. I want to switch gears a bit, and I want to talk to you another favorite topic of yours, which is collaborations, right? And you've been talking a bit about it, and the whole idea that the only way we've seen collaborations is between, say, two fashion brands coming together and bringing out a line. uh, but what I'm seeing, for example, in markets such as India, is that collaboration is so key because some of the tasks that you are kind of attempting is so mammoth, right? I mean, you're trying to educate a bulk of rural India on why sanitary pads are important and hygienic and so important. You're trying to keep girls in school, in case of say
Hmm.
Whisper and Procter and Gamble. You're trying to get education down to the mainstream through channels like Google and YouTube and so on and so forth. So the task in many categories is so huge that if you're able to ride each other's infrastructure, so if a video service provider rides a internet service provider, boom, you go from 4 million to 600 million
Hmm.
overnight.
Hmm.
Right, because you're using somebody else's kind of facilities in that way. So this whole idea of collaboration, doing it together, it brings a lot more energy and resources in the task that we are attempting in building categories. And more importantly, it allows us to ride each other's infrastructure and not having to build it all by ourselves. So one of the, for example, conversations we are having right now is with Netflix,
Hmm.
where we are their agency on building collaborations with other brands. We're not the agency for marketing communications. We are,
Right.
in fact, saying, how do we build a particular piece of content and map it to the code of a certain brand and help build partnerships? Right. So
Fascinating.
that's an
Yeah.
interesting area, and I'd like to know your thoughts on how could we do this better and what are you seeing happen around you?
Yeah, well, my interest in collaboration was kind of re-kickstarted a few years ago. I went to see a guy speak who's called Professor Sir Lawrence Friedman, who's the head of
Mhm.
military warfare at King's College London, the university. And he'd just written this huge tome called Strategy. You may have read it, but it's a really exhaustive analysis of strategy, all the way from chimpanzee colonies through all of world history. And I mean all of world history. It's a really big book,
Wow, I should pick
all
it
the
up.
way
I
up to
haven't read it. Yeah.
contemporary politics. And he identifies two or three key themes in strategy through all of these things.
Mhm.
So one is adaptiveness. So he
Yeah.
starts the book with a famous quote by Mike Tyson: "Everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face." But one of his other key themes is alliance and coalition. And so the point he makes is it is inherent in strategy to actually partner and collaborate with others. So, for instance, in a chimpanzee colony, how do you take down the silverback? Well, you don't try and do it on your own. You get a few of you together. You wait till the silverback's looking a bit peaky. You hustle them off into the jungle, and you work out how you're going to run the place on your own. It's inherent, and yet so many of, and certainly historically, my clients when I was in advertising, and indeed until about a decade ago, they tried to do stuff on their own. They had a head of partnership who sat in block 3, level 4. You never saw them except for once a year. And the notion of partnership was usually to do with distribution arrangements rather than anything else. But what you're talking about, which I have a lot of energy for, is a much more fundamental form of collaboration.
Yeah.
And my interest, actually, funny enough, I think partly because clearly, India is a kind of enormously exciting growing market in the way that the UK isn't, for instance. But my interest in collaboration is a kind of complementary one to yours, really, which is how, as we come out of COVID and we try to rebuild very often what are quite shattered communities, I think,
Yeah.
and the after effects of this. A lot of these after effects are not yet visible to us, certainly in the UK and I think in the US. We haven't yet seen the damage, but it will become emergent to us. How are we going to do that? And I'm really interested in how brands and entities and businesses will need to collaborate much more to create
Yeah.
sustainable long-term solutions. So went off to a couple of years ago to interview a guy who works in a building society, which is essentially a mutually owned bank in the north of
Yeah.
England. And they were trying to, they were kind of challenge a very little resource, but wanted to genuinely be a presence, in a physical presence in local communities where there weren't banks anymore. So they went to the local town council and said, what can we do to partner with you, perhaps in local libraries? And so they started in a single local library in a place called Stockton. And they said, effectively, look, we'll help you, we the Building Society Bank, will help you keep your local library alive at a time when public services are being cut. In exchange, you give us a very small part of it, nothing like the counter of a normal bank,
Yeah.
very small part of it. And what's been interesting is the exchange of learning that's occurred. So the building society, first of all, it's been an enormous success. It is they have the
Amazing.
fastest number of sign-ups in that branch. That's not
Mm-hmm.
a branch, it's a library. On the other hand, people are going back into the library after 30 years of not being in a sort of
Yeah.
relationship with the community is going up. The people who work in the building society have to stop at 4 because they have to come and help the kids who are coming in for read with teacher sit down. So they feel
Yeah.
engaged, excited, part of what's going on. The building society has learned how to work with really small formats, which is going to be really useful for the future. So it's an exchange of culture, it's an exchange of learning,
Yeah.
it's an exchange of understanding, much more than a kind of a flag of convenience. And everything you're talking about is about that, saying, yes, of course, there's a kind of mutually beneficial alliance and partnership here. But I bet at the same time, there's an exchange of learning and understanding going on, and those
Yes.
kinds of deep collaborations you're talking about, which will affect each culture and the way they think about their future in a
Yeah.
very intrinsic way, which is much more than Adidas partnering with
Yeah.
Rapstar, which is
Yeah.
a form of news or novelty. So I think collaboration is,
Yeah.
in a sense, an unhelpful word actually, because there's so many dimensions to it. But it's that
Yeah.
deeper collaboration, I agree with you, that I think is at the heart of new strategy. And I
Yeah.
wonder if we should start thinking about what new strategy versus old strategy is in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because I mean, that also raises question. There's so much in the old strategy being about competitiveness and about, just being different, and the resources are limited, and your company and your brand needs to grab an unfair share of it. That's what strategy, uh, in many ways, has been about. And now we are saying that we are better together, rather
Mm,
than rather than a view of the world which says resources are limited, and my only job is to build a competitive advantage, right?
yes.
uh, so some of that needs to be recalibrated as well, I would imagine, because you need to begin to see, it's the conversation I was having with Sapna Chadha of Google, where she said that despite the fact that we have YouTube, it's all right to partner with, say, Spotify.
Hmm.
Right now, that's a beautiful way of saying, yes, we compete, but we can also be friends, and we can do greater things together.
That's nice. And my understanding is that Nike now has this concept of what they call pre-competitive spaces. So it says, look, big challenges, right? We need to create more sustainable ways of dyeing clothing. We can't use up the amount of water we're using on dyeing. So
Yeah.
we will partner with Adidas and anybody else who's interested to invest in and create these ways of dyeing clothes without using any water at all. So
Yeah.
that's a pre-competitive space. Of course, there
Yes.
is going to come a moment where we hit the
Yeah.
we hit the high street or the virtual high
Yeah.
street, and at that point
Yeah.
we'll be very competitive. But I like that notion of uncoupling. It's not a
Yeah.
world of absolutes anymore in the same kind of way, is it?
Yes.
It's a world of kind of when rather than
Yeah.
if. And I think that's a
Yes.
really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating as well. Yeah. Yeah. So, Adam, let's talk about beautiful constraints a bit, right? And I know it's a full book, and there are a lot of theories in there, but we can capture as much as we can since we have you here. I mean, one of the reasons I, for example, like my work in India and Asia, and why I find this so fertile, is because it has so many challenges to solve, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always fascinated by the idea of technology and data and innovation coming together to help solve problems, which are real problems here, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
believe that yes, you can use AI and data to do a new fashion line in Milan, and that's fine. That's a good use of data. But can you use data and technology to keep girls in school in rural India?
Mm-hmm.
Can you, for example, use technology to save accidents on the road? So one of the products we just developed, it's called Street Eye, and it's a device which you strap onto a motorcycle, and it has lidar technology, which is a well-known technology now. It's available in your mobile phone camera as well. We use
Mm-hmm.
that technology to find out the submerged potholes and navigate the rider around it,
Brilliant.
right? and
Brilliant.
and submerged potholes have been cause of many fatalities on Indian roads.
I
So
bet.
it's a device we've developed, and it's in partnership with ACO, which is an insurance brand and has a huge stake in two-wheeler insurance. So I mean, that's how we're solving a constraint of poor roads, accidents, with an insurance brand whose whole job is to cover risk in some
Fantastic.
way.
Fantastic. And
So
and just
talk,
so is that
yeah.
a business of yours that you've created
Yeah,
effectively?
so what we've done, Adam, is that we have a team called Apollo 11, which is an innovation team. So we have product designers, we have data strategists, we have very young talent, but not not a typical advertising talent, and their job is to solve problems in ways beyond advertising, using not just words and images.
Mm.
So this is a product of that team, and so we have a product designer sitting in our teams. We have data strategists sitting in our teams. We've actively kind of invested in these talent, because our belief is that building brands and marketing is no more just about words and images. It is
Hmm.
about using technology, using data to solve real problems.
Fascinating. Yeah, fascinating. Well, listen, I share your fascination with constraints, and I think one of the things that I guess I'm struck by about constraints is, so first of all, that they have a bad rap, right? They
Yeah,
you know, if we did a bit of word association now about constraints, mostly the words that would emerge would be bad words, about limitation or restriction or
yeah,
making us less than we could be. But actually, particularly with our backgrounds in advertising, we kind of know that, you know, the famous David Ogilvy quote, "Give me the freedom of a tight brief," right?
yeah.
And actually, as a parent or as a sports person, we know that constraints in certain parts of our life are enormously beneficial. They're the thing that make things rewarding, actually, and better. We just are not taking that understanding into business. And I was kind of very struck by this, because I thought initially that perhaps there were just some really good people who are just naturally creative, because there is a kind of veneration of creative people in the advertising business. Some people are just creative about constraints and some people aren't. And I went off to interview a guy called Michael Beirut, who's a kind of rock star designer at Pentagram in New York, the design company. And he said, I don't think this is about people who are good or bad at it. He said, I always start in victim mode. You know, when I'm faced with a constraint from a brief from a client, I always start by thinking, this is ridiculous. How on earth am I supposed to solve for this? I mean, it's clearly impossible. And then I get very grumpy and my bottom lip kind of goes a bit sort of iffy, and my team try and stay away from me for a couple of days. And then we get together and we start saying, well, maybe there's a way through this. And actually the constraint leads to something better. It's a stimulus to something better. And what you need to do with this book you're writing, Adam, with my partner in San Francisco, Mark, is try and have just enough tools and just enough system to help people get from feeling like a victim to being more transformative in their approach to
Mhm.
it. And
Yeah,
I wrote it in part, and Mark is the same. You know, we've got we had at the time kind of sort of teenage / early children in their early 20s. And I genuinely believe that our ability as individuals, and indeed as groups, to understand how to turn constraints into sources of opportunity will define our happiness and success in our personal lives as well as business, and indeed
mhm.
as citizens of the planet. We have to do it, right? The planet demands that we find ways to turn our constraints into opportunities. So a beautiful constraint really is just it's about sort of 5 or 6 kind of key frameworks and tools in helping people understand that. And I'll just talk about a couple of them that
Yeah,
I think the kind of center of gravity is. Because a lot of it is what we were talking about earlier, which is framing things in a way that make you question assumptions, right?
yeah,
Um, so that the first is just was inspired by. Can I take a few minutes to tell you a story? Is that right?
yeah,
We have
yeah.
something.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah,
So I was going off to interview. Sorry, I was going off to see Tom Ford, the kind of designer,
yeah,
entrepreneur, businessman,
yeah.
speak on stage in a cinema in London. He was talking about his first film, the film with Colin Firth called A Single Man, and he was being interviewed by this journalist from the Times of London, talking about, and he was very confident and talking about his authorial vision and Colin Firth and filmmaking and that kind of stuff. And then the woman said, right, any questions from the audience? I put my hand up, and he saw me and he pointed to me and he said, yes, badly dressed man at the back. And I said, I've heard, Mr. Ford, that you describe your catwalk shows as filmic. You know, what have you learned from the world of film that you've applied to fashion? And what have you learned from the world of fashion that you've applied to film? And his body language changed completely. He went from this alpha pose to kind of leaning forward and putting his hands together. And he said, what you have to understand, he started talking about constraints, right? He said, what you have to understand is in a catwalk show, you have 13 minutes. He repeated it, 13 minutes. And he said, and you have a very cynical, seen it all audience. You've got all these celebrities waving at each other. They've seen 5 shows already today. They'll see another 16 tomorrow. And yet you have to convince them that yours is the most exciting vision that they have seen in Shanghai or Milan or Mumbai or wherever this fashion show is kind of appearing. So he said, you have to have a very clear vision and you have to tell it very dramatically. Boom, act 1, models come out, turn the lights down, the music up, boom, act 2, on you go. And then he said the thing that absolutely nailed me. He said, my ambition by the end of that 13 minutes is to get the entire audience breathing in and out at the same time. I will know that my catwalk show has been a success if, as the last supermodel leaves the stage, I can hear the entire audience exhale as one. And first of all, what a KPI that is. I mean, talk about new metrics. What a KPI that is. But secondly, think about what he's doing there. So this is all about the relationship, isn't it, between ambition and constraint. So normally, if a constraint is imposed on us, we lower our ambition. We think, I've only got 13 minutes, very cynical audience. What can you really do? What's our metric? The metric is I kind of want them to remember this till next week. He doesn't do that. He says it's a big, big kind of constraint. So I'm going to raise my ambition to an almost ludicrous degree to go alongside it. And it's the intersection between that high level of ambition and that high level of constraint and the specificity of those constraints that leads to Boom Act 1 and that kind of drama. So the first part of, I think, making your constraints beautiful is to put the constraint very specifically in the question alongside a big ambition. So normally I've spent much of my advertising life taking constraints out of questions and saying, let's just do blue sky this. Imagine we had no constraints, what could we do? And of course, that's not what he's doing. What he's saying is, let's put the constraint right in the middle of that question. And I think if you look at breakthroughs in businesses, it's because they put the constraint at the heart of the question. And the discomfort that creates causes us, if you talk to cognitive scientists, causes us to question the relationship between those two things and actually leads to different conclusions. And you could argue it makes us productively uncomfortable. And actually making ourselves productively uncomfortable in the world is what we should be doing more of, right? Because that's the way we get to new kinds of answers. And the second part of it was, well, I thought, okay, that's interesting. I went collecting different difficult questions. So IKEA set themselves the kind of, I call this a propelling question because it propels you out of all the data you've gone to, the people you've talked to, the ways you usually answer questions, the business partners you use. So, other kinds of propelling question. We work with Audi in the States, and they had to launch the new S8, and the consumer wouldn't buy it unless it was much faster than the previous car. It's a high-performance car. The regulator wouldn't let them sell it unless it was more fuel efficient. So they had to produce a faster car that was more fuel efficient. Propelling question, how do you do that? IKEA produced their famous kind of LAC table, which is their student table, which they wanted a well-designed table they could sell for $5, which is roughly double the price of the disposable latte you put on it. I mean, these are very difficult kind of questions, of course. And then I thought, well, how do you answer these? And there's a guy who I interviewed, who's the CTO of a big bakery business in the UK, who was trying to reinvent the bakery business. And he said, I don't allow anybody in my team, when we're trying to answer a difficult question, to start their sentence, we can't do that because. They have to start the answer, we can do that if. We can do that if. And it seems like a kind of small nuance, but actually I think it's quite profound.
It's amazing.
Because, isn't it? Because it does three things, I think, which are really important. One is it keeps all the energy in the conversation in the team around what you want to keep the energy on, which is how do we answer this question, rather than allow it to drift into a different question, which is this a question that could be answered? Secondly, it keeps optimism and curiosity alive at the same time. And there's a lot of evidence, as you know, from the work around kind of grit and tenacity. The more optimism you can create in a team up front about their solution, quite apart from what the solution is, the more likely they are to hurdle the speed bumps and corporate antibodies that come their way later on. And the third thing is, if you believe as a culture that we are the stories we tell about ourselves, we can, if tells a story about ourselves that we are inventive people who find lateral solutions to difficult problems. We can't do that because it says we are people who tend to fall at the first hurdle. So what a lot of what the book is about is kind of creating a kind of CANIF map that then prompts different starting points. So it's just enough stimulus for a team that wants to try and approach it themselves.
No, that's fascinating. In fact, to your point on saying ideas around constraints and how they're so fascinating. And I've been in workshops with some facilitators, and they suggest just think without any constraint. And at the end of the workshop, you say, "Wow, pat yourself on the back. You've got 115 ideas today. Awesome!" And none of those 115 are usable because they're all totally out of the constraint, right?
Exactly.
In fact, my partner Raj and I at Leo Burnett, we run something called as a fight club. So what we do is we get all our 12 executive creative director teams, and we give them client briefs, real business briefs, right? And these briefs are not supposed to solve for a TV campaign. They're supposed to solve for a real business problem. So
Right.
solution could be a product idea. The solution could be a distribution change or anything, or could be a technology platform. And we bring these 5 clients and these 12 teams together, and they work on it for a month. And then we bring the clients and we give them the solutions. And some of the really fantastic out of the box solutions have been found using these briefs or constraints in your language, as you would say.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay. Could
Yeah.
you give us any examples?
So, I mean, for example, one of the pieces that we did out of this is we called Jeep Democracy, right? And the problem we were solving for Jeep was it's an outsider brand, it's a slightly more elite brand, and how does Jeep as a brand? And India is not too much of an off-road culture, right? I mean, our roads are like off-road. I mean, they're fairly broken.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole idea was how do you get a brand like Jeep closer to India as an emotion? And while solving, we came up with this idea that the biggest event in India is actually the democracy, where every Indian goes and votes, right? I
Right.
mean, apart from the religious events. And we realized that there were villages in India which has never voted because they could never get to the polling booths,
Oh, brilliant. That's a
right?
brilliant
And
idea. Yeah.
and we brought the two together, right? And we called it Jeep Democracy, and we took Jeep and initially with Jeep as a brand, later with the Jeep community, we took Jeeps to these villages where people had never voted, and we ferried them to the polling booths, and we got them to
Fantastic.
participate in democracy. So here you have, right, a brand which is about off-roading actually enabling something so beautiful in the lives of the people, because we gave a bunch of creative people this constraint to solve for in real life.
What a great idea. What a great idea.
Yeah. And then obviously, I mean, we had lots of calls from Jeeper community saying, this is so beautiful. I want to be part of it. When are you doing it again? And it's, I mean, something like this has a life of its own.
Yes, of course it does. Of course it does. I
Yeah.
can see why.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's my turn to ask a couple of questions, right?
Yes,
Fantastic.
Adam. Yeah.
So tell me about. Listen, I love challenges. Tell me about what are the 2 or 3 challenges in India that you think are most exciting at the moment, and why?
Yeah. I mean, one of the brands, Adam, is PhonePe. It's a brand that we are working with currently, and it's a digital payment solution. When they started working with us, they were competitors to Google Pay, right? And you take a brand such as Google, is such an omnipresent brand. I mean, everybody loves it. And we were talking to the founder of PhonePe, and he said, "How do I ever get past something such as a Google in payment system? I mean,
Hmm.
everybody knows them in rural India, on the roadside shopkeepers. Everybody knows them, and the millennials love them as well, right? Here's a brand which has an appeal right from the roadside of India to the elite sections of India, and they just are such a familiar brand that they just need to say that they're in payment and they'll grow. And PhonePe was like, that's my real challenge. Can you help me beat Google Pay? And and we started working on that brand, and kudos to them. Obviously, I mean, a large part of digital payment is the distribution and acceptability and so on and so forth, and they worked really hard on that. But one of the things which worked for us in building that brand is that we pretty much pretended that we were leaders of the category.
Right.
Right, we pretended that we were the leaders of the category, and as leaders, and to the conversation we were having early today, as leaders we challenged all the constraints of the category. So we
Right.
said, why can you not pay fast? You can pay through phone pay. What all can you make payments with on digital? You can do all of it with phone pay, right? Where can you make payments through digital? You can do it with phone pay. So we took on all the challenges of the category as a challenger brand and played that as a leader brand. And last quarter, in fact, PhonePe exceeded Google Pay. So
Really,
they are now the
really
number one digital payments brand in the category. So I would say that's one big brand to watch out for. Yeah.
fantastic. And so, in doing that, did you effectively, you think, influence the culture as well, or was the culture already there and they just needed pointing in the right direction?
I think we built a lot of cultural behavior because the culture is extremely comfortable with cash and very comfortable, if at all, with card to some extent. But
Mm.
we did shift the cultural needle. Some of it, obviously, I have to say, Adam, also got its impetus from the environment. I mean, the fact that there was a demonetization in India about 2 years back, where they barred use of cash overnight, and that changed a bit of a behavior. And pandemic itself, because people were scared that the notes carry the virus to some extent, so it also got
I
impetus
see. Right.
by the environment.
Yeah.
But the fact that PhonePe managed the leadership was because we managed to challenge the category and the current behavior, and pretended that we are the leaders, if you may like.
Well, so let me ask you one more question before you can ask me a couple of things again. The one of the questions I loved that we were sharing when we were just thinking about what we be fun to talk about was your question, which is how do you rise up after failure? And I'm
Yeah.
happy to answer it from my point of view, but tell me, how do you do it? How do you rise up after failure?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But to my mind, it's as simple as showing up every morning, right? I have reduced it almost to a reflex behavior. And to be honest, I mean, I've been a strategist all my life, did 20 years of strategic planning, right? And then now I'm running a P&L, right? And I'm being a CEO. And it's a tough one. Some of my friends, when I ask them, should I take up this job, they ask me, do you have a thick skin? Right? and, and, during the day, I mean, there'll be some failures because you're a service brand, right? There will be failure, there'll be challenges with people, with clients, with strategies, with credit product, and so on and so forth. And my thing is that whatever happens through the day, next morning, show up and bash at it again. It's as simple and as behavioral as that, than anything more conceptual for me.
Right, right.
how about
Fascinating. Yeah.
how about you, Adam?
So I it's all about the morning for me. So I get up early. I'll get up at about 6. I'll go for a run. I live by the river. I'll go for a run along the river. I'm not a fast runner, but I'll just take it at my own pace. Be out there, nature. If it's sunny and I'm intoxicated by light, so I find light incredibly reinvigorating. And then I'll get back and I'll get a big pad, like a big kind of flip chart pad, and I'll just sit down. And we have a kind of a garden room, which is half in the garden, half in the house. And I'll just sit down and I'll think and I'll start writing. I find that I work through things by writing
Yeah.
effectively, and it's that combination of getting out and resetting and coming back again and working out what I'm going to do that kind of allows me to kind of rebirth my energy and motivation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's interesting. It's a good tip as well. Yeah, excellent. So that's a very interesting end to the conversation, Adam. We can go on and chat forever, but we're running out of time. Thank you so much for such a fabulous conversation. Very stimulating, very interesting, and also gives us a few more issues to think about, discuss, and develop theories upon.
I've really enjoyed it. It's been a really, really fun hour or so. So thank you very much for inviting me along.
Thank you, Adam.
So if you'd like to follow up with me, my Twitter handle is Eat3bigfish. I'm on LinkedIn, Adam Morgan, or indeed you can email me at adam@eatbigfish.com.